Hello, and welcome everybody. I think we'll start. So welcome to this British Academy lecture hosted in partnership with the University of Bristol. My name is Helen Simpson and I am the extremely long titled Associate Pro Vice Chancellor for Research and Innovation for the Faculty of Arts, Law and Social Sciences. So the British Academy is the UK's National Academy for the Humanities and the Social Sciences. It mobilises these disciplines to understand the world and shape a brighter future. It is an independent fellowship of world-leading scholars, some of whom are in the room today, a funding body for research and a forum for debate. Held in partnership with universities across the UK, the Academy's lecture programme, which is curated by its own fellows, showcases the very best scholarship in the humanities and social sciences, stimulates debate and reflects the breadth of these subjects and the academic perspectives within them. In a minute, I'm going to hand over to tonight's chair, Professor Mark Gillings, but before that, the second most exciting part of the evening, the safety announcement. If there is a fire alarm, it's not a drill, so please make your way calmly to the nearest exit, which will be the doors you came in, but I think there is also another one there. And also to note, the toilets are by the stairs to the right-hand side of the foyer. So you would go out of those doors there and then turn left. So that with those two important pieces of information given to you, I'm going to hand over to tonight's chair, who is Professor Mark Gillings. Mark is Professor of Anthropology and Archaeology at the University of Bristol, and he specialises in the theory and practice of landscape archaeology.
Thanks very much indeed. Welcome, folks. This evening's event is part of the Albert Reckitt Archaeological Lecture Series on archaeological research, which was first delivered in 1951. Ooh. I'm delighted to introduce this evening's Reckitt lecturer, which is Professor Mel Giles. Mel grew up in Dorset under the shadow of the impressive hill fort known as Hambledon Hill. It lies on the edge of Cranbourne Chase, close to another hill fort known as Hod Hill, and that's also the site of a Roman fort. And this proximity to the Iron Age and to the Roman forged a lifelong interest in Mel, in not just the Iron Age, but also martial identity, weaponry, and earthworks, and particularly what happened when the Romans decided to step foot in the British Isles. She started digging with Professor Barry Cunliffe on the Danebury excavations, and later worked with archaeologists such as Chris Gosden, Mike Parker-Pearson, Niall Sharples, and Mark Edmonds. What a collection. On Iron Age sites ranging from Brittany through to the Hebrides. Now, Mel's research, including a forged glamour, landscape material culture and identity, and more recently bog bodies, face to face with the past, showcases a growing interest in not only the burial archaeology of Britain, and particularly that of the Yorkshire Wolds, but also the well-preserved remains from bogs and mosses across Ireland, Denmark, Germany, the Netherlands, and beyond. On projects such as Grave Goods with Duncan Garrow and Neil Wilkin, Continuing Bonds and Lost and Found with Karina Croucher, Chariots and Cynefin with Adam Gwilt, she sought to make burial archaeology meaningful to wider audiences, particularly by working with museums, speaking powerfully to themes of grief, loss, and bereavement. Now, Mel is part of that unique generation, to me, of Sheffield landscape prehistorians, who I think will be discussed in awe in future histories of the discipline of archaeology. Mel's work has always combined the rigour of archaeological fieldcraft with the vision, skill, and expression of an artist, of a poet. Now, at a time when archaeologists are beginning to argue that we need to ground our stories about the past in wonder, in enchantment, in care, and in love, I'd just like to point out that Mel's been doing that for nigh on 2 decades already. Now, this evening, Mel's going to share some of the results of the last 15 years of research on Iron Age warrior identity, exploring the lives and deaths of Iron Age people who made, wore, wielded, and were wounded by Celtic weaponry from 2,000 years ago. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Professor Mel Giles.
In the harsh winter of 1980, sappers clearing unexploded ordnance from the Yorkshire Wolds hit an unusual signal with their metal detectors. It turned out to be a rather curious bit of misshapen iron, folded almost in two. As they lifted it from the chalky loam of this steep slope, they realised it was not alone. There was a body, skeletonized, interred in a shallow grave by an old earthwork bank and ditch. The archaeologist John Dent and a small team headed out, braving snow and ice, to retrieve the remains. And in his 1983 paper on Iron Age weaponry and wounds, he refers to this discovery briefly, noting the odd condition of the sword and a series of cut marks on the rear of the cranium. It was obvious that the person buried with the sword had died by it. And in 2014, the British Academy graciously awarded me the Albert Reckitt Small Research Grant to investigate his story further. I hope my lecture this evening can show where this kind of award can lead, and I dedicate this paper to John Dent in memory of his intellect, generosity, and academic grace. This is a story of the Iron Age or Celtic warrior, told through the evidence brought to light by archaeology. But it's not where such stories normally start. This is the statue known as the Dying Gaul, displayed in the Capitoline Museum in Rome. It's carved out of pale marble, conjuring the milky white pallor of barbarian skin that so fascinated Virgil in his description of a Gaulish raid. Yet once it may have been coloured with pigment. It's a Roman copy of an earlier bronze statue thought to have stood in the Temple of Athena at the heart of the Pergamum Acropolis to commemorate victories over Galatian forces. But classical audiences, whether they were stood in front of the bronze original or the Roman marble copy, would have been in no doubt that they were standing in the presence of a northern barbarian. His muscular nudity, his hirsute appearance, sporting a fine moustache and spiky tufts of hair, the torque around his neck, the oval shield on which he is slumped, these provide a visible lexicon of difference, of alterity and savagery. Yet the original sculpture wanted to capture something extraordinary in the final moments of this defeated foe, that suggests that despite his barbaric appearance, he exudes courage and nobility in the face of death. Now, this romanticised embodiment of martial virtue and valour is a common exoticising and othering colonial trope. And such stereotypes have dominated our vision and understanding of the Celtic warrior. How can we see past such images, and why does that matter? The Romans saw the barbarian northerners, conceptually lumped together later on as Celtic, as innately violent, obsessed with warfare, says Strabo. It served their agenda to believe that certain races had a natural proclivity for violence, a nature they could use to both justify conquest and then later harness within their auxiliary forces. Yet whether we are, as a human species, natural hawks or doves, takes us into the philosophical territory of Hobbes, Rousseau and Montaigne, and their contrastive view of humanity. Whilst that kind of division is ultimately polarised and unproductive, as Routard argues, it continues to overshadow modern studies of violence. Now, archaeologists have sought to contribute to that debate through their models of social evolution, suggesting that certain kinds of violence go hand in hand with specific stages of development. Chiefdoms were seen as hierarchical, usually patriarchal, upheld by warrior elites who were freed from agricultural labour by an underclass, and they're rewarded by their chief with prestige gifts of weaponry. Whilst we might see this model as equally problematic, it still shapes our textbooks and our museum displays, as seen here in the Danebury warrior at the Museum of the Iron Age in Andover. Meanwhile, the archaeological data that we dig out has been used to serve the interests of contemporary sociologists, evolutionary biologists, and anthropologists. In Steven Pinker's study of violence, The Better Angels of Our Nature, he argues that the relative frequency and lethality of violence has gradually decreased over human history. And he makes that argument based on archaeological data drawn from Keeley's War Before Civilization. Pinker argues the archaeological record shows that between 7 to 40% of deaths in pre- or non-state societies could be directly attributed to violence. Now, Ferguson warns us here of the misuse of that data and the potential warification of the past. Yet, as Simon James argues, we've got to guard against the opposite, a pacification, particularly of the Iron Age. So popular images like this, drawn by Simon James, of a masculine armed chieftain supported by his warrior nobles may be problematic, but we can't avoid attending to the topic of violence in prehistory. That was the position of the authors of the Iron Age research agenda over 25 years ago. How far have we come since then? What do we mean now when we talk about violence? How can we unpick those stereotypes and think about the different character and form violence might take, what its uses and consequences might have been? And why have I made this the focus of my recent research? It's clear that what we say about conflict and violence in prehistory, the data we make available to other scholars, will be used to make large-scale, deep-time claims about humanity. So to borrow a phrase from Donna Haraway, we need to stay with the trouble. Whilst her book urges us to think about new ways to reconfigure relations between humans and non-humans in our contemporary damaged environments, at its heart is that difficult work of living and dying together. So I'm rooting myself here in my discipline, archaeology's commitment, to explore how power and personhood were shaped and reproduced in the past. Violence concerns the creation and destruction of order, then and now. It both makes and unmakes social being. It can be a blunt or more sophisticated tool of power, reinforcing the authority of dominant groups and perpetuating the success of individuals through actual or threatened violence. Bellicosity can therefore be thought of as an honourable and successful way of being, or as Harrison puts it, certain kinds of groups enjoy conflict because of the socially invested respect and reward it can bring. It is destructive, damaging, but it can also be generative of renown or status. And by working at the boundaries of cultural order, it can also be an instrument of agency and change, capable of being deployed in an entrepreneurial, if risky, manner to alter the terms of power, not just underpin them. But violence is relational. In a book I continue to find influential, the anthropologist Giles argues that anger can be conceptualized as a form of love. Revenge is its debt when violence is done to kin. Yet in the volume in which this paper sits, The Anthropology of Love and Anger, Overing and Parsons argue that the goal of most small-scale non-state societies is to live well together. And when violence occurs, they are interested in the efforts people go to restore not just social bonds, but cosmological order itself through equal acts of sociality. So we need to bring to our study of violence what Hamby and Gritch call a web of violence approach, to follow the extent to which different kinds of interpersonal violence are connected across contexts, over the lifespan of somebody's birth, through adulthood, into the lives of victims as well as perpetrators. This includes, in Judith Butler's terms, those who come to lead disenfranchised, ungrievable lives. So we need to balance accounts of bloodshed and trophy taking, both of which we'll see, with commensal acts of feasting, gifting and games, through which competition and tension was negotiated, scaled up or dialed down, and the binding performances through which social relations might have been restored. To not just look at the wounds, but their aftermath, whether that is care or grief work. We need to explore not just life courses, but deathways, to follow violence thanatologically in terms of the toll it took upon the living, as well as the dead. So we can begin with a definition of violence, and I'm drawing here on Redfern's use of the World Health Organization's definition, encouraging us to look not just at the physicality of human-to-human violence, but that wider work of harm that can be done to people's lifeways, their environments, psychological fear and intimidation, as well as the structural violence of endemic inequalities, conditions such as incarceration, enslavement, or forced movement. Building on some of the work of Iron Age scholars shown here, we can explore that osteologically in our burial archaeology, but we know we're going to be looking at a biased record of those wounds that leave a skeletal trace. and then hunting for the more subtle biological markers of people who've lived difficult lives, deprivation and punishment. Only certain kinds of well-preserved Iron Age remains, such as the bog bodies, can allow us to probe the more subtle wounds, flesh wounds, for example, and sadly they're beyond the scope of tonight's paper. So we can reframe our studies then to also move out from the body to include architecture and the environments of threat, what Redfern memorably calls predatory landscapes. And I have a particular interest in what I would call martial material culture, not just in terms of what it could physically do, but what it did psychologically as well. And in the case study that I'm going to unfold tonight, I'm going to delve into that thanatological kind of aspect of violence, to follow what happened to those experiencing conflict, the mourning that was done for those who died violently. And it's through that embodied lens that I think we can explore how martial identity might have been perceived in the Iron Age and how such figures were remembered. Burial archaeology matters because, as Fraser Hunt puts it, this was a projected image, which can be, in other periods, simply a way of marking elite status. A sword does not make a warrior, though a warrior may need a sword. But I am interested in whether our burials with weaponry are mere projections of this warrior identity, like this little chalk figure that you can see here, a 3D replica of which I have down at the front, if you'd like to come and see him later, or whether there is a reality to the lived life behind it, experiences which tell us about people earning that renown. Bellicosity is then a political trope that people might adopt, and I'm going to try and follow some of its micro-politics here and explore whether the scale at which we're seeing this in one case study specifically relates to heroic combat, family feud, small gang or band raiding, or intergroup violence. Was there intent to wound but allow people to walk away, or was it intentionally fatal, involving recidivism, butchery? Martial power is, of course, derived from its latent threat, that eruptive possibility of violence, as Whitehead puts it. And whilst I agree with Niall Sharples that conflict is probably endemic in the period I'm exploring, we need to distinguish between these different scales: posturing, verbal, gestural threat, or actual armed assault. And this enables us to explain, in Whitehead's terms, the poetics and practice of violence. I'm going to start with a quick scamper through the weaponry of the Iron Age. And when we think of it, it's my title slide, we often think of the sword. Here, beautifully reproduced, both as a proper kind of Smith replica by one of my students at the University of Manchester and in Simon James' wonderful watercolour image. The sword is the most peculiar and particular of weapons because its sole purpose, unlike a knife or an axe, is to kill or maim another human being. This gives it a symbolic power and a valence that sets it apart from other weapons. The Kirkburn sword is made of iron in a bronze sheath. Its front plate is inscribed with Celtic art, which draws the eye down its length. Worn on the back, importantly, its hilt, grip, guard and chape are inlaid with red glass, and it was designed to look, Simon James suggested after drawing it for many hours, as if it was dripping with the blood of an enemy. But there's a deeper meaning to the colour red, the colour of vitality, life-giving as well as bloodshed and loss of life, which I've suggested explains its vivid and persistent use on martial material culture in the British Iron Age. Iron Age swords vary in length across the Iron Age, with both long swords capable of slashing, fracturing and massive blood loss, and the shorter swords or daggers more able to slip between the ribs for stabbing and puncturing at close quarters. Yorkshire's northern swords are short, with mid-scabbard suspension plates or rings, so we know that that's how they're worn on the back. And it's Ian Stead's excavations in the Great Wall Valley that proved that some of our warrior figures are probably still wearing their sword in its harness. And this is how they are depicted on our little chalk figures from slightly later in the Iron Age. That back hafting may have enabled somebody to run with or carry the sword whilst on horseback, but it's clear that for the most part, these swords remained sheathed. They're not really very easy to draw over the shoulder. So they would have been visible on the backs of men who no doubt carried them with swagger and menace. But they were also objects of beauty and meaning. In the Asby sword, for example, this is an object replete with aspects of animal symbolism. Its shape, protecting the sword blade edge, flares like a fishtail, meaning that the scabbard might be seen as analogous to the slippery, piscine body of creatures that were rarely eaten in the Iron Age. Perhaps, Neil Sharples has suggested, because they're rather fond of river excarnation, giving bodies to the waters to be eaten by the fish that dwelt in their depths. And so fish might have been seen as agents of excarnation or even embodiments of ancestors themselves. The Celtic art, which swirls down this sheath, may have been seen as the eddies and flows of water and weeds that hid the pike and the sturgeon. But grip that sword in your hand and point it at a foe, and something else becomes visible. Hopefully you might see the lentoid eyes and narrow humanoid face right in the centre that might allude to the decapitating power of this blade. But hiding within these designs are two bulbous-eyed heads of sharp-beaked birds, fluttering their wings in aggressive combat, suggestive perhaps of the kinds of display seen between great-crested grebes. The embodiment of animals within weapons suggests a desire to both evoke and capture their skills and qualities, virtues such as daring, aggressiveness, defence of one's territory and competitive display, speed, agility and valour in combat drawn from the world around them. We can see some of these elements of design in the Witham shield as well. And again, right in the centre of the boss, it's been suggested that those little red beads of glass are the eyes of two combating grebes. But at the top and bottom bosses, we have horned bovine heads, and once the outline of a long-legged boar, the fiercest animal you could face in the Iron Age landscape, who would fight to the death. These martial menageries make sense to the artisans who drew their elements together not just to decorate or embellish, but I would suggest apotropaically strengthen the object they adorned. Those that wielded them were empowered and emboldened by the combination of the boar's brute ferocity, the bellicose bull, and the darting strike of the water bird. Together they tell us a lot, I think, about training and fighting styles, combining speed with force. It's long been suggested that by Celtic art scholars that Celtic art hides within it playful and entertaining designs that delight the viewer. But in the Celtic Art project led by Chris Gosden and Duncan Garrow, they suggest something more. Drawing on Alfred Giles' art as a technology of enchantment, they suggest Celtic art is used to ensnare and entrap viewers in mazes of visual complexity that were thought to be almost supernatural in their design. So Celtic art, whether it adorns a sword or a shield, or tellingly a mirror, works upon its viewer to enchant, but also, in the right circumstances, terrify those who gaze upon it. It's doing its work to deter violence as well as wreak it upon the body. So it works as a form of psychological warfare. But I hear you say the shield is merely a defensive object. Well, yes and no. I owe my insights here to one of my great PhD students, Dr. Matt Hitchcock, whose thesis involved training with the Manchester Riot Police. A shield can ward off missiles and blows. It can deflect the armed hand or the fist. But it can be also used to pin down, crush, batter or bruise, or even choke the throat. And this is why I don't hold with the idea that these bronze-faced shields were simply ceremonial or show items. Their Bronze Age bindings enabled this offensive work. And any projecting boss or rivet head or edge binding had the capacity to graze or tear open the skin. As a site of future infection in a world without antibiotics, it might be slowly fatal. And recently our eyes have been opened to the world of organics that we seldom ever recover archaeologically, which probably formed the mainstay of Iron Age weaponry. The Enderby bark shield, carefully excavated by the wonderful unit ULAS and studied by my great friend and colleague Dr. Sophie Adams at the British Museum, was made of willow bark, stripped from the tree and soaked, stiffened with laths of crabapple and finished with hazel roundwood edge binding. It was a much lighter weight shield than the ones we've looked at so far, and its willow bark boss might not look particularly menacing, but hidden within it were a series of black thorn pins, perhaps for keeping the basketry together. Yet slow thorns are also known as the farmer's curse, notorious for causing septicemia. Clatter this shield in someone's face, and its consequences may well have been slowly fatal. Shields were designed to deflect a series of objects. The spear is probably the most common weapon of the Iron Age, studied comprehensively by von Einel, ranging from small, short weapons to longer javelins. The only complete example from Fiskerton is pencil-thin, covered with beeswax to aid aerodynamic flight. But recently we've realised that some of our spears are really quite massive, the Melsonby Hoard, for example, Clinkerig Bach. And some of our most humble spears have been hiding in plain view, misdescribed in our artefact reports as bone awls. We now know from analogy with the Hortspring boat burial in Denmark that these are our most humble spearhead, made of splintered bone. And from the new discoveries that are being made through archaeologists working in bogs in Ireland, such as Ida Clune, we can see that we've got a whole range of weaponry that we haven't been thinking about. Sharpened yew spears, slowwood clubs, mallets and staffs. And this is some of the damage that those kind of objects can do from a series of crania at Danebury Hill Fort. And we can see the silhouettes of spears, also the mark of an axe, and then a blunt compression force trauma in one cranium that is a result of our most humble weapon, the slingshot. Water-worn pebbles or ovate clay shot like this are found in their hundreds at hill fort sites like Danebury and Maiden Castle. And in the Iron Age, there is no tradition of archery that we can identify. So prey, predator and foe are only brought down through the use of the slingshot or the spear. And I think that tells us a lot about the courage that is needed to bring down a boar or a wolf or a deer, and the value of the horse and the dog as companions in the hunt, the training ground for interpersonal violence. Yet into that world of weapons, I also want to put objects like this: iron slave chains, manacles and shackles, organic hobbles, withies and nooses. And again, some of these are only known to us through our bog bodies. Many of those objects associated with incarceration are only seen in our latest Iron Age period. And there is a sense in which that act of enslavement is probably very much encouraged by our contact with Rome. And it's at that stage we start to see little bronze figurines of enslaved and bound figures. And finally, I want to draw attention to our vehicles and our vessels, for which the Iron Age is famous. Chariots and log boats, which I think can also be conceptualised as forms of weaponry. Compressing time and space, they enable people to intimidate others through their speed and their drama, their noise and their spectacle. Chariots can be effective platforms from which to hurl javelins and also insults. And the Romans tell us, when they encountered them, that our vehicles are mostly used to intimidate an enemy before the charioteer dismounts to fight. The sound of driving in one of these replicas has been described as being like in a wood in a storm. The flash and jangle of horse gear and the flailing hooves would have been sensorially overwhelming. Chariot ponies must have had an extraordinary bond with the charioteer, who was, we're told, by the Romans capable of astonishing feats of prowess, running down the pole shaft while the chariot is in motion, then leaping back into the chariot box, and a kind of astonishing martial gymnastics. So I want to sketch out, before I unfold some of my burial archaeology, the many arenas through which martial prowess would have been performed before any blood was shed. Sports are, after all, a kind of symbolic warfare. We need to write into our accounts stories of chariot and boat races, eating and drinking competitions, feats of extraordinary oration, storytelling and music. The carnix and other bronze instruments, for example, are also mentioned by the Romans, who recalled that after one encounter with them, their brazen noise made it seem like the landscape itself had come alive. All of these were arenas for competition, to work things out with rivals, settle scores. But many of our weapons come not from trophy displays or burials, but hoards, swords and shields thrown in rivers, weapons amassed and given up to the gods. And David Fontaine has suggested that this giving up of weaponry might be tied to the life course of an individual, that people retired their weapons as they progressed into older age, suggesting that being a warrior was not a permanent part of your identity, but a stage of life which was passed through. So we have an image of how Greeks and Romans perceived their foes. How did they depict themselves? This diminutive yet menacing little boat crew is found in Holderness. It's made of yew, and the figures have little quartzite eyes, which make them really rather unnerving to encounter. And again, I've got an injured version of one of those dropped by one of my students this term, sadly, just for you to see just how unnerving these things are to hold in their hand. And they give us a particular image of the physique of an idealised warrior, a long chest, thick calves, fast runners perhaps, or sturdy boatmen. But they do more than that. This is an assemblage where an arm is both a paddle and a club, suggesting a synergy and a melding between the body and the vessel and the weapon. The boat itself has an animal head, an otter perhaps, or a beaver, animals that slipped between our liminal terraqueous zones of land and water. The figures are equipped with detachable yew penises, which can swivel, and were thought too racy to display. They were hidden away in a small box in Hull Museum for a number of years. Talk about toxic masculinity. But bereft of those appendages, the empty sockets suggest more of a female form, as Bryony Coles argued long ago, and that embodied gender fluidity may well have been deliberate. They double their power, their vitality, oozing intimidation. But we can draw out of this little boat crew something more radical, an ontology, an understanding of being, which recognises that martial power emerges in that messy material amalgam of people and things, or as Delander puts it, more than human violent assemblages. And so in my talk, I'm very much drawing here on that wider material turn across humanities and social sciences, where we realise that capacities like violence arise through the combination, the bringing together of people and objects and places. And obviously the idea of an assemblage is particularly attractive to archaeologists, but it does more than this. It talks about the way in which the whole has properties that the parts don't possess. It's relationships, not the inner nature of an object, that does the work. Delander's drawing here, of course, on the work of Deleuze and Guattari, who criticise archaeologists' fixation upon technological thresholds as causal drivers in warfare. It's not the individual elements of the saddle, the stirrup, the horseshoe and the harness which transform nomadic warfare in the Bronze Age steppe, they suggest, but that man-animal weaponry, that assemblage of speed. So Delander brings together an understanding that weapons and bodies, terrain, tactics, supply lines, even morale, are components that assemble together to create a martial force, whether that's a single-armed figure or a warband. A sword alone does nothing. Its capacity to wound only emerges when combined with a trained arm, an intent, and an enemy. Violence is thus a property of the whole arrangement, not the object itself. That's not to abnegate human responsibility. People still do the wounding, the killing, but it shifts our focus away from individual objects to the network around it. And approaching Iron Age conflict through those assemblages encourages us to explore how they come together in the moment as relational systems. Violence is emergent, arising through that particular assemblage at any one time. So I'm going to explore that through some of the case studies that are close to the Ruse-Carved figures themselves, and here's some of their weaponry, their shields and their paddles and their clubs up close. The Ruse-Carved figures are derived from a landscape in which we have a very unusual kind of Iron Age settlement record. And I'm drawing here on the work of lots of other Iron Age scholars who have been attracted to that region, including myself for my PhD. This isn't a landscape of hill forts. Settlements don't have fences. They don't need them. There are big linear earthworks, but they carve up large areas which probably relate to pasturing and particularly the control of access to water in this landscape, which was a real pinch point, I think, as seen here in the Great Wold Valley, where the Gipsy Race, a seasonal chalk stream, would have been absolutely fundamental, particularly to the pasturing of cattle. These are the kind of landscapes in which I expect violence would have flared in a hot summer as groups coalesced with their stock to drink. Now, the dead of times past, Bronze Age barrows, new Iron Age square barrows, kept watch over those proceedings. And in the wetlands to the west and south, the lush river pasture must also have drawn people and stock. At Heslington East, part of the University of York, excavations revealed a watering hole that had been befouled by the placing of a decapitated head face down in its waters. They had kept this early Iron Age head marvellously preserved, which led to much amusement in the local newspapers about a brain being found at the university. But this is a violent act that wrecked life in many ways, for people, for cattle, for the land itself. And at the site of the marsh fort of Sutton Common in South Yorkshire, a place of central grain storage, 2 intimidating decapitated heads guarded the entranceway to that site. Now, whether they're ancestors or grain thieves, we don't know, but the message was clear. Those wetlands held other precious resources, reeds, moss, car woodlands, but one of its most precious products was iron bog ore for their blades and their chariot wheels. And perhaps this is what drew the individual that I know fondly as George to Holderness. George is another decapitated head, now in my care, but looked after for a lifetime by a farmer who found him during drainage ditch clearance as a young man. Whilst his mother was not too keen on George coming home, and we know that he was boiled to remove the fleshy bits, which she didn't really like, Tony Watson insisted that this head was now in his care. The police and local museums were not interested. What we can say of his life and his death is that he was not a local. Research work with the Comios project, led by Ian Armitt at York, has shown that his isotopes don't suggest the chalk, an origin on the chalk geology. He's not an unusual outsider. He shares a signature common to a number of other incomers in the region, perhaps hailing from as far away as North Yorkshire. But George, a young man in his prime, fell foul of a violent incident in the wetlands. From left and right, a sword and an axe, before his head was placed at the edge of the waters, close to the knoll of Round Hill. As Paul Venant has argued, the disfigurement of the corpse can be part of post-mortem violence, denying them what he calls a beautiful death. Dismemberment wrecks memory and it intimidates others. And in Eric Carlson's evocative image, we've depicted a George-like head in the midst of a ritual focused around the Ruse-Car figurines. It too was finally sunk in a box in the same marshy waters of Holderness. Wherever home was, George never made it. Preventing the return of a body was, as we know from Hector's fate in the Iliad, another form of violence against both the dead and their kin. And we know that we are missing some of the men from our Ara cemeteries. Some of them set out to feed stock, gather resources, trade or raid, and never returned. At the Burnby Lane Cemetery, excavated by MAP archaeological projects, however, we have an example of a poor young man who suffered a sudden and brutal death with multiple sharp force traumas all across the body. This is the only example of recidivism that I know of from the Wolds. But the body was returned, and his relatives sought to cope with his untimely death by burying him deeper than any other burial in the cemetery, face down, prone, so he's covered by the water table. Sudden death, robbing people of life and vitality, can create a revenant, an unsettled soul, who may rise and walk again. So I think here we are glimpsing the thanatological practices used to deal with the unquiet dead. Further north, on the other side of Pocklington, another young man shows evidence for both a hard youth and a traumatic injury to his face. The large dent in his forehead and his broken nose had healed, but he did not have a long life. When he died, his kin buried him in a moment of spectacular drama, ripping the spines off his shield and scattering its fragments at the foot of the grave. And then gathered around that graveside, a group of armed figures thrust their spears into the burial. Some were iron-tipped and still bear the traces of the shield that they punctured, stick out of the grave like spines or bristles. Others were made of bone, and this is another way in which we see that range of weaponry present in the Iron Age. So this moment of noisy, dramatic spectacle, a communal shattering and splintering, is part of how his comrades crafted a fitting or beautiful end for a valorous friend who died before their time. Akin to our gun salute, I think. The burial can be read, as Martin Carver has argued, as a practical trace of a kind of martial funeral poem, allowing this moment of noise and drama and theatre that hopefully pleased and appeased the deceased. Another individual who survived a moment of traumatic combat is the man buried with a chariot at Wetwang Slack, set apart from the main cemetery in a small group of 3 spectacular chariot burials, which we suspect now are probably a group of relatives buried together. And DNA analysis has suggested that cemeteries like this trace their descent through the matrilineal line. And as a PhD student, I was very curious about the strange obsession people had with being buried next to very old ladies, particularly old ladies with blue glass bead necklaces. We now know from the DNA analysis that these are the grandmothers, the great-grandmothers, the great-great-great-great-grandmothers, through which people are tracing their line of descent and through which people inherit their land and the stock, the women who held things together when men left and didn't return. Wetwang Slack 1 is one of these nearly missing men. In her PhD, Sarah King noticed that he had a slice taken off the side of his head by a sword. That is a real hole left in the side of his cranium. The bone is knit back together. There is no sign of infection. He survived this for many years. He also has a healed right humerus trauma and some other blunt force trauma to the head. But he was probably a very changed man. Sarah King uses an analogy with the Diaries of the Surgeons General from the American Civil War to explore what this kind of trauma might have done to an individual. And there it's sabres that are doing that work. They're associated with a sudden change in character, perhaps unsurprisingly one of unpredictable rage, such that these soldiers are often invalided out of the army even if they do survive. So we can only imagine the fortitude of this young man during his recovery, the network of care and respect shown to the survivor. But as someone who now works with veterans as part of Operation Nightingale's rehabilitation and community work, I think these stories are really important for us to tell. We can observe his beautiful chariot matching that of the male on the other side of the central female burial, identikit of swords and chariotry, and again a set of spears here with their spear shafts snapped and scattered across the grave. But if these are martial figures of power, perhaps that makes us look a little bit differently at the woman in their midst, perhaps their mother. She's old, undoubtedly wise, buried not with a blade but an iron mirror. Its wrought plate may have never accurately reflected her face, but we know that early mirrors are seldom objects of cosmetic vanity. They're often instead perceived as tools of augury in the form of divination called captroptomancy, used to look into the past or the future, to spy or scry upon others. I would argue this is also a weapon, a supernatural one. We underestimate her power at our peril. There are longer-lived men in these communities too. The mild charioteer, or as I like to call him, the dragonfly charioteer, buried with a tiny diminutive brooch whose red glass, rilled body and bulbous eyes remind us of the ruddy darter that haunts chalk streams. And we might think of that as an odd creature to embody and adorn your chest with if you're of the standing of a charioteer. But what speed, what agility. The dragonfly has the highest successful kill rate of any predator on Earth. This old man, with 2 teeth left, was buried in his chariot box, the vehicle wheeled into the grave, its pony team still in harness, poised as if cantering off to the Yorkshire wolds. Shortly before his death, and probably a contributing factor, he has suffered a fractured rib in a fall. A much older healed thigh wound and vertebral damage speak of a hard-working life and the wear and tear of working with horses and vehicles. They too have their own story to tell, each pony bearing the signs of hard work and fast riding, which we would now associate with racehorses. One of them, the older, probably female pony, has an unhealed penetrative chest injury, as if she's run into something at speed. And when I talked about this burial to a metal detecting group in South Yorkshire, they conjured an image of a truculent old man who insists on taking that chariot out for one last drive, and it all goes horribly wrong. They literally shouted from the back room, "Leave the keys at home, Grandad!" So this did not end well for chariot team or charioteer. Yet he is the embodiment of male authority and power in what Neil Sharples would call a strong grid society, drawing on ideas from Mary Douglas, where renown comes with age, skill, wisdom, and individuals are distinguished by these special objects of power. including, in his case, a fabulous shield that he was buried on, covered again with Celtic art, and it's been one of the great joys of my life to work on the shield with my PhD student, Matt Hitchcock. And we think within its designs, we can see many of those animal motifs I talked about before, water birds, bulls, perhaps even in the tiny bosses, that humble mollusk shell, which of course did its work of protecting a vulnerable fleshy body. So I hope I've conjured through these case studies an idea of how the assemblage of weapons, people, animals and vehicles and ideals came together in East Yorkshire to create a particular kind of warrior figure. Violence is actually rare and usually face-to-face, more along the lines of heroic combat. Despite some of the examples we've discussed, it's usually non-fatal, and there is a sense that blade bearing is a young man's game, perhaps given up after the sword-bearing years as age sets in. So I like to think that the chariot itself is a wonderful embodiment of the kind of approach I've taken. I could have talked about very different case studies, the hill forts of Wessex, and their very different kinds of architecture, a much more paranoid and, it turns out, violent community with much more evidence for social inequality, and small group evidence for violence, as at the hill fort of Danebury. And Rebecca Redfern and I are shortly about to publish a paper with others where we've compared these two populations, showing real differences in survivorship, mortality rates. Basically, if you live in East Yorkshire, you're more likely to survive your childhood, but old age is harder. And that may well be because you are sharing the work. There is less social inequality across the community. Although they, on the surface of it, look like the most martial of the communities we could study in Britain, violence is actually lower. And I think all of their gear, all of their kit is effective in deterring bloodshed. There's a lot of swaggering, a lot of riding around, but actually that sorts things out in ways that simply weren't possible within some of our hill fort communities. And in Wessex, I think we are looking at changes that are wrapped up with the impact of Rome between the Caesarian and the Claudian conquests, where new ideas about social standing, basically some people are encouraged to think of themselves as kings, and the idea that you can unmake others, make them into enslaved peoples, feeds into new Roman ideologies. Now, occasionally we glimpse examples of figures who withstood, who resisted Rome. And one of the other lovely case studies I was drawn into in my career was that of the North Burstead warrior. Effectively, we think, a conflict migrant who flees Caesar's conquest of Gaul to find alliance with his British kin. It's one of the things that Caesar uses to justify his invasion of us. Buried with local pottery, he seems to have been made welcome as an incomer, probably perhaps valued for his knowledge of guerrilla tactics and Roman strategies. Like some of the East Yorkshire burials we've studied, his weaponry is ceremonially damaged, ritually killed, the sword bent in half, the shield bobs ripped from the backboards, for again a dramatic martial send-off. Yet the only damage this individual has experienced is basically self-imposed. From gripping his pony tightly between his thighs to control him, and swaggering around with an enormous helmet on his head, crested with two gigantic and very heavy Celtic artwork plaques. Now, whether this helmet is fringed with boar hair to resemble a ferocious beast, or crested with feathers to resemble a fighting cock or our grebes again, his body took the toll of playing that part of a warrior, inspiring courage and inciting resistance. And this is the Novium's wonderful depiction of him in his heyday. But perhaps we can see some of those stories from the late Iron Age in a slightly different way. We know that we have lots of different tribal leaders who change sides, who deceive the Romans, or one moment are with them, or one moment against them, who incite resistance and then run away up to the north. Caractacus, for example, asking for safety with Cartimander. She does not give it. And we could see this as a bit of a messy type of resistance to Rome. But Pierre Clastres would see that in a very different way. This plethora of fractured, martially fraught confederacies disrupted Rome's attempt to grip hold of who was in power at any one time. So the martial nature that Rome both envied and vilified, Clastres would argue, is an effective way of trying to resist the conquest itself. I hope to continue this aspect of my research through a new project, a 5-year study of the Pembrokeshire chariot burial with my colleagues in Amgueddfa Cymru, Museum Wales, and local communities to craft a story of somebody who lived through that conquest era and was buried with his chariot, the last chariot burial in Northern Europe, replete with extraordinary weapons and this amazing horse gear covered in really quite blingy Celtic art. This tells us about a new stage of defiance and resistance to Rome, and I can't wait to explore all the hidden gems within that assemblage. I'm going to end then where I began, with our Acklam warrior. I think we can call him that now, and the legacy of the Albert Reckitt grant. Delving into this man's past, we found him to be short and stocky, but a robust man who had probably been an expert craftsperson, using his teeth as a third hand, perhaps a fibre or leather worker. But when we looked deeper, we also found out he was chronically unwell, suffering from what Charlotte Roberts identified as a clear case of tuberculosis, at the moment the second earliest case known in Iron Age Britain, though I suspect that will change. I suspect it's there in greater amounts. Consumption is not a good death, certainly not a glorious one. And while Charlotte saw in his deliberate killing a fear, a persecution of the diseased, I saw something different. Like many of his martial companions, his send-off has been dramatic, his sword nearly bent in two, and his grave fittingly overlooks the dramatic scarp slope of the northern wolds, as if keeping watch over those dangerous wetlands. This is an honourable burial. Perhaps sudden and violent, assisted death at the hands of his comrades was preferable to a slow decline. He leapt into it, as the Dinka's famous spearmaster must do, embracing death. Today, I've suggested an assemblage approach can help us tell richer and more nuanced stories, stories that trace networks of martial power through the specific people, the animals, the objects and places in which violence unfolded. This is what archaeology does. When we excavated the original burial site, we noticed something else. That the burial had been dug into a narrow band of the red chalk, the hematite-rich Hunstanton Formation. So by the time he died, the Acklam warrior was hemorrhaging blood. He died bloodily by the sword, and he was buried where the land itself was red. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mel. Now we've got time for a few questions. If anyone would like to kick us off. Mel, the Roos figurines made me think about partability.
Yes.
And you're talking about ontologies and understandings of the body, decapitation. Can you move do the different arms fit in different Roos figurines? And did you get a sense of play and mixing of those?
Yes, we know there are more objects than were ever recovered. His leg's going to fall off. I'll warn you that, Mark. Very sad. But yes, bits come off, bits go back in. When it's one of the earliest examples we have of photographic kind of messing around, because people reconstruct them and they shove different bits. For many years, the penises were in the arm sockets, like tiny stumpy arms, and then they realized what they were, and then they took them off and hid them. But there's an arm that also has a socket at the end, so it's meant to hold something else, like a paddle or a spear shaft. And some of the objects were too fragile; they just disintegrated and were never recovered. One of the figures, very interestingly, was taken home by one of the ordnance surveyors for his daughter as a dolly. This is the Victorian era where dollies were wooden, and he made it a new arm and she dressed it up. And when she died as an old lady, her grandson found it and thought, wait a minute, I've seen one of those before in the whole museum. And he, took it in and said, I think this is one of yours. So yes, these things come together and come apart. The boat itself is too small for the whole crew. So we've got 2 crews. Maybe there were 2 boats, but we don't know what we've lost. But yes, I think this tells us about that idea that you were a warrior because you were in this flow of things that were where your arm ended and your sword began, where the shield and the defense work it did, or the body of your comrade next to you, these things melded together. And it's very different to our little chalk warrior, who is this singular seated figure in repose. I think there's a huge shift in how people see themselves over that time period.
Thank you.
Oh, lots now. Now you ask.
Right. You're all a little too quick. So,
Lady with the earrings. Lady with the earrings.
Earrings.
So the question relates to any continuities from the Bronze Age and the kind of weaponry we see. The Late Bronze Age is a period of huge diversity in weaponry. Loads of different bronze swords, in particular rapiers, daggers, a greater range of bladed weaponry. And then the early Iron Age looks quite quiet. And we know that there might be many reasons for that. Environmentally, it's quite a hard time to live in. But we don't have a tradition of iron blades really until the Middle Iron Age, when ironworking really kicks off in a substantial way. So there is a hiatus, I think. So there is a commonality in an obsession with swords, but there's a real shift, I think, when iron technology comes in.
Any other questions? So, chap at the front there.
What is the figure of 15% deaths by violence based on? Does it have any graph?
So with Keeley's figures, they've been severely critiqued and unpicked. As archaeologists, we know that, I mean, I'm unusual in dealing with East Yorkshire because most people get buried. It's the only population for Iron Age Britain where we can explore that at scale. So we're dealing with a biased record elsewhere of who gets buried. And I think people who have traumatic deaths are more likely to get buried. So that's why our figures for violence, whether we're looking at a Neolithic group violent event with bodies piled together, probably look like inflated statistics of violent death. Against that, we have to be cautious because we know we're not going to see a huge amount of the violence that happens because it's flesh wounds or it's rape or it's people getting thumped. And we're simply not going to see that on the skeleton. So those statistics are unreliable, which is why the paper with Rebecca is going to be really fundamental, because we're trying to look across the social life course. And I am not very good with statistics, but our statistician on the project is. So those are weighted so that we are comparing the fact that we've got fewer burials from Dorset with more burials from East Yorkshire, and looking at those rates of violent death and altercation. And a lot of the trauma we see is probably agricultural. People fall off ladders. People get crushed by a cow. That's not attributable to interpersonal conflict. So we've been very clear to distinguish where we can see that.
I think we've got time for one. Yeah, chap in the green.
What I'd ask, are these material finds and the cultures they represent, are they unique to Britain? Is it the UK thing? Or do you see it reflected in similar things across Europe?
Oh no, I mean, you could, if you were asking Ian Armit to talk about this, he would share, extraordinary, martial cultures from Gaul, for example, and there we have some really quite alarming sites, and Denmark, where we have much larger group violence and also what looks like small standing armies. They're in identikit. So there are ranks. People have a certain set of weapons and a certain rank of kit, and we can see that that's probably being influenced by Roman ideals. In Gaul, at Roc Pertus, we have skull pillars with crania stashed in them. We have trophy display sites. So the scale of violence elsewhere is greater. I'm not pretending that that's not going on. And tomorrow, one of my Irish colleagues could find an Alcanenga out in Ireland, and that could really change our understanding of the scale of violence in that landscape at that time. So my story is really quite intimate to the Wolds.
Now, thanks very much, folks. If you have a question, I'm sure, Mel, you'll be delighted to answer over a glass of of vino?
Absolutely. And I bought some hands-on things. So yes, we have our poor Ruscar figure who is lost his leg. These are digital visualizations created by Heritage 360 from the University of York, and they really give us a sense of coming close to these figures. The other replica I have is a miniature shield. This is from a copy of one found in a votive hoard of lots of miniature shields. They're how we identified some of our shield styles. But you'll see the care and attention that's been given the Celtic art. It even has its own little handle on the back. So do come and look at that. And these are real sling stones from Hambledon Hill, where I started, picked up as a child. So it has really been a lifelong obsession.
That's really, that was neat. I see what you did there. Very, very neat. Please join me, folks, in thanking Mel for a fantastic lecture. And the wine reception is out the door, calmly, calmly, and around to the right. Thanks very much indeed.